Hey, everybody. All right. I'm doing an interview with a gentleman that I did some research on who I was surprised at every turn when I did research on him. Um, he founded the first organization devoted to Black and Hispanic law at Temple University while he was still a student there. He's, if I'm not mistaken, still a member of Temple's Board of Trustees, where he's been there since 1992. This autobiography that you are looking at, and I'm just going to read the English because I have him say it when after I introduce, is Not From Here, Not From There. And it was put out September 28th, 2018. And it is described as a mantra for Puerto Ricans who feel like foreigners wherever they go and who seek a place for themselves. He grew up in a New York tenement and high rise in West Harlem in the 1950s. And he was the only Latino law student at Temple University when he was there. He is also the grandfather of one of the young people that I interviewed on Torn, Miss Leilani Diamond. So I want to introduce you to Judge Nelson Diaz. Is it Diaz?
That's right, Diaz. That's correct, Juan.
Okay. All right. And I'm not telling you all his other accolades because we are going to talk about his accolades, but I'm going to start first after I get his book off of the screen. We're going to start with growing up in Harlem in the 50s. Most of the time when Harlem is mentioned, people think Black people. And before the interview started, you gave a brief story of your heritage. Tell us again what you are made of.
Well, my grandfather on my mother's side is Taino, which is a native Indian of Puerto Rico. My grandfather on my father's side is African from Africa. And many of them came from West Africa. And my other parts of my heritage come from Spain, one from the Canary Islands and the other one from Murcia, which is the European side. So people who don't really understand or know me or look at me fine and say, what are you? Well, I was co-founder of the Black Law Student Association, as you indicated. Well, I consider myself part of the African American community. I consider myself part of the Latino community of this country. And to some extent, my book really reflects sometimes the fact that as a Puerto Rican who has all of these cultures, I'm not accepted in the island because they see me as a U.S. person, or in parlance, they say a New Yorican. And when I'm here in the States, I'm not accepted by the Mexicans. I'm not accepted by the African Americans. I'm not accepted by the whites. And to some extent, I'm not here. And we have been a colonial country for so long, 400 years under Spanish rule, and then 100 and some years under the U.S. rule, that colonial mentality has hurt in a great extent the development of a community that I believe, has the parlance of what America should be looking like with all of these cultures, and we're not accepted as an equal citizen or equal parlance in this country. So most of my achievements and most of my success has been because of Martin Luther King, his march on Selma, his activist roles in the civil rights, and his death created an opportunity for me to go to law school. And as a result, I have dedicated most of my career to the improvement of civil and human rights till this day.
Okay. And speaking of which, when you entered law school, how old were you?
I had just graduated from St. John's University, so I would have been 22 years old. And when I
Okay.
finished law school, I was 25 years old.
Okay. And you got your Juris Doctor from Temple, correct?
Temple, yeah, I was the first and only Latino in the law school, but I was also the first Puerto Rican and obviously the first Latino to have passed the Pennsylvania bar.
Hmm.
And as a result of that, I became the elder statesman. And so when you're the elder statesman, you're the first of a lot of things after that.
And speaking of the, well, no, since we're already there, I'll go back. Um, Speaking of the first, you're the first, if I'm not mistaken, first Latino to be judged in the state of Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. Um,
Also the youngest, so I'm still a
oh,
kid.
wow. Okay. Okay. So with all these firsts that you have, obviously, with the civil rights movement, you were a first because you just said that you weren't accepted anywhere, but you still wanted to fight for the cause of fairness and equalness. So when you were being the first with the bar and getting these degrees, what for people out there today who are just used to, saying, "Hey, I'm going to Temple and it's no big deal or whatever." What was it like being the first? How were you treated and what was that atmosphere like for you?
That's a very good question because I didn't know what to expect. Coming out of Harlem, there was some diversity in Harlem. We had, obviously some whites, blacks, and Latinos. So there was a little bit of diversity. And in New York, there are people from 100 different nations. Coming into Philadelphia, Frank Rizzo was then the mayor of the city. The commissioner, he got elected a year after that. He was a commissioner of police and then the mayor of the city. And it was a city that was riled with controversy and racism. Very little opportunity. At Temple Law School, in its history, in the prior 8 years that I got into school, only 4 African Americans had graduated from the law school. And in the history, since 1776 till 1972, only 76 African Americans had ever passed the Pennsylvania bar. There was a process in which people had to put their pictures on their applications for passing the bar, and traditionally they flunked the bar. At the law school, 2/3 of all students were flunked out every year. And so it was very difficult also for African Americans to get past the law school process. It was really related to the fact that there was considerable amount of discrimination in the legal profession when I was there. I'll give an example of one. Coleman. Coleman was Secretary of Transportation under the administration of President Ford. Coleman graduated from Harvard and could not get a job in Philadelphia. As a result, he went to New York and worked as a lawyer in New York. Coleman just died about 3 years ago. He wrote a book. After the writing of his book, which is only about 6 or 7 years ago, he got his Phi Beta Kappa key from Harvard University. So to some extent, we can see the history of deprivation and the history of honoring many of the people of color in this country. So what we see in my development, the fact that I played baseball with a guy who used to play in the black leagues I understood there were two major leagues. There was a black league, which was an African American league, and there was the major league, which was a white league. And as we know, through that period of time in '57, it sort of got integrated, but there was still a lot of black ball players who couldn't get into the major leagues. And having that issue, I had a coach who used to sleep on park benches, who lived off the quarters that he could get from us and sell sneakers, what we call Converse sneakers. And that's how he survived. But he was such a sports enthusiast that he created some of the best baseball teams in Harlem. And I played for him for 7 years. Um, and that really kept me off the streets, really important to us, and kept a lot of other kids off the streets. Um, Leroy died about 95 and 96. I missed it by a year to be able to see him and thank him for all that he had done. I met a minister who was at a Democratic Party activity, and he was from the church right there where we used to play ball, and they had hired him. And so I was so happy that he continued to do what he loved, was to have sports program for the kids, but he then was paid for it instead of the fact that he had volunteered. Move on forward, the crack and cocaine epidemic occurred in Harlem during the period of the 60s and 70s, and it was a really difficult time for many of us. And the fact that I had some intervention in my life by some ministers allowed me to really begin to believe in myself and believe, you know, the whole concept of what Jesse Jackson talks today, you know, God doesn't make junk. If you believe in your God, then, you know, there's nothing impossible for you. That became drained within my mentality in terms of my life. And when that got drained into me, I was a horrible student. If you see the report cards that my mother kept, unfortunately, you see how bad a student I was, how I had trouble with the language because I was predominantly Spanish speaking at home, and how I really couldn't master most of the schoolwork. And I don't know how I got through and passed through the classes. But once I had that sort of revelation, the fact that even these teachers didn't care about the importance of an education for me. They figured, you know, he'll wind up driving a truck or doing some other kind of work. I was not really college material as far as they were concerned, but I really committed myself to the fact that I wanted to get out of Harlem so that I could essentially support my parents and try to make sure that we were not a part of this whole cocaine problem, which was affecting public housing, which is where I grew up. I grew up in public housing, which was the first place I ever slept in a bed, for example. So public housing was important to me, but the fact that there was no real management of this issue had caused considerable amount of problems in Harlem. I did well in college somehow. I couldn't get into a 4-year program, but I got into a 2-year program at St. John's, and I was on top of my class, and I graduated in accounting in the top of my class. And then I was going to get a job, not knowing that I had an opportunity to go on. And it was because of Dr. King's death in '68. I graduated in '69. That this program was created, which was a Council of Legal Education Opportunity, that was attracting African Americans into the legal system. And I was one of the first 5 Latinos to be recruited into this program. And I wind up in Philadelphia, which I keep thinking was the worst situation for me when I got there. But, you know, God works in mysterious ways. We were able to change that school. And today we have thousands of African American lawyers in Pennsylvania when we were very, very few, and almost none worked at any major law firm in the city. In fact, all the firms that blacks worked in were essentially black law firms. They were their own practices. So it was very, very discriminatory. People think the South is bad. I'm telling you, Philadelphia was probably one of the most racist cities in North America.
Hmm. Okay. Well, something you mentioned earlier, and so you were talking about the presidents. So you worked for a president and a vice president. Tell us about that.
I was pretty much of an advocate at the time, and I was doing economic development in North Philadelphia, which was an urban area in North Philadelphia. And I had been working also with a mentor of mine was Charlie Bowser, who was the first deputy mayor of the city of Philadelphia, really the first African American ever to hold any position of substance in Philadelphia. And I was also filing a lot of lawsuits, suits on voting rights with regard to bilingual voters, suits on education. I filed a suit against the federal government on the fact that most Latinos couldn't pass the test provided by the Employment Commission of the federal government, and that changed the direction of the exams that were given. So I was involved in defending someone who firebombed a Puerto Rican family. I was involved in a kid that was chased by a bunch of white kids into the river and died in Philadelphia. So I had been involved in many of these things. And this White House Fellow Program came into my view. And so I said, well, there have been very, very few, if any, Latinos or Puerto Ricans or women who have been a part of this program, which was created by Lyndon Baines Johnson in '68. And in '68, if you remember, it was some of the height of the Vietnam War. And they were trying to attract young people to be involved in and understand federal government so that they would come back to their communities and be able to educate the community on those issues. So I filed essentially because I wanted to file a lawsuit, not because I wanted to get in. Well, on my 30th birthday, not only did I get accepted, but I couldn't file a lawsuit since I was got accepted into the program, and had a wonderful, wonderful experience with Vice President Mondale. It was Jimmy Carter's, had just gotten elected 6 months before. I began in September, which was sort of the beginning of the second year of his administration. And I got to tell you, I thought I was getting away with murder. I was able to bring and change many policies that I didn't think I had any ability to, and mainly because Vice President Mondale was so supportive of my education and my participation in the program. And what I learned from him was you don't solve everything with lawsuits. Sometimes you have to walk 3 steps back before you can walk 2 steps forward. And he taught me the art of negotiation and the art of education and trying to bring about coalitions. And that was what I took back to Philadelphia. And I created a bunch of economic development organizations back in Philadelphia after that, and got elected to a judgeship 3 years after I came back from that experience.
Okay, and then you worked for a president. You worked directly for a president.
Yes, I was the general counsel of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I was the first Latino to be confirmed by the Senate to a general counsel position in the United States. And it's not that long ago. That was 1993. And during that opportunity, I was able to tell people that God has a real sense of humor because I'm able to reform public housing as a person who lived in public housing. And so there was a great reform period in which I created a program which was named after me, the Diaz opinion, which allowed to develop mixed use housing. Now, why is that important? Well, if investors and developers want to develop housing, they usually do it in market driven areas. What was happening in public housing was they were putting housing in the worst areas, the worst conditions, and mostly in areas where there was no transportation and no schools. So by doing this opportunity that allowed developers to coexist with public housing authorities and do developments, we created housing that was very attractive. And so now everyone wants to be involved and wants a public house in many of these areas. And they are now, some of them are marketable. And now they have people from different salary structures, different family structures, different professions living within the same community, while what was happening was it was basically single mothers with children living in these houses. And the reason I say single mothers with children is because you couldn't see a parent in a house that had a father. Why? Well, you know, these regressive laws in which you saw so many people being arrested for drug and drug addiction issues eliminated a lot of men from the household. Since if you had a felony, if you had a criminal record, you were no longer qualified even for public housing, let alone jobs and other situations. So the poorest people, and still are women with children in most urban communities.
Okay. Something you said earlier, a lot of people, the public, think that crack was something of the 80s, but crack and cocaine was something of the 80s. You mentioned it earlier as a 60s and 70s thing. And I know why you mentioned that. But can you elaborate and explain and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Back in the late 60s and the beginning 70s, heroin was available, but then crack became a more marketable substance. That destroyed most urban areas because of the availability and the sale of crack and cocaine. There was the war on drugs created by Richard Nixon back in 1972. So the war on crime and drugs was predominantly executed in urban communities, where Black and brown people lived. If you look in 1972, there were only 350,000 people in federal prisons. Today, there are over 2 million people in federal prison, mostly from that war on crime and drugs coming from the 1972 crack and cocaine epidemic. We lost many of our young people in that period of time, either to the Vietnam War, to crack and cocaine, or to HIV and the virus. It was a horrible period in the life of urban America. And we would be in prison, unlike today when they talk about opioids epidemic, they talk about it as an illness. With that community, they were talking about it as a crime. And as a result, we have lost probably 2 million brown and Black people who are in prison today, when they come out, who have lost all of their civil and legal rights as a result. Once you're in jail, uh, in many states you can't vote. In many states you can't get a job, and in many states you can't get uh, a lease to be able. So it was a tough situation in terms of us, and I was afraid of what's happening in Harlem, and I wanted to save my parents. My stepfather, for example, got mugged 3 times in 1 month in 1972. Last time he was mugged at knife point, they had taken all his clothes off. There was such a drive to get money so that you could buy, because I don't know if people understand. Once you've had a heroin high, it's something that's irreplaceable, and you need that heroin or that cocaine high back. And so it drives people into incredible crime and activity in order to be able to afford the habits that were occurring in those communities. And it was treacherous because then also there was very little management of the housing. They started to draw back in terms of even having the cleanliness, the elevators would break down, and so forth and so on, which I had an opportunity back in 1993 to be able to reform, and which I'm very happy about that, I was used in that position. And today, I think we have better public housing than we had then. I mean, a great example of what my decision and my ruling made is the housing that was developed in Atlanta in the area of the Olympics. That housing there is a very, very attractive housing. If you see the housing that was there before that, you see how horrendous and how separated that was from the rest of that city.
Okay. You also mentioned this, and I, from time to time, I do a comparison between the two. You talked about HIV and AIDS, and I compare that to COVID because of the time frame for vaccinations. What do you think about how this country has handled both diseases as far as trying to eradicate them?
I'm embarrassed to tell you that in those days we kept thinking that maybe in the crack of cocaine they were trying to eliminate our community by allowing us to, get high and sell, and obviously the police activity. Today, with the COVID, most of the folks who have been most affected have been the Black and brown people, not because of intentional activity, but because of three things. One, they're the essential workers who are still out there working. Two, they have underlying issues. Like me, I have asthma, so I'm easily with underlying issues. If someone gets close to me, I'll get the virus. They could kill me. And our folks have high blood pressure, have diabetes, and have some of the other underlying illnesses that if we get the virus, we have a worse effect than if we were in better shape. Four, we have the worst healthcare capability because there are so many of our folks who do not have health insurance, and as a result, have very poor healthcare opportunities. And the concept of all of that, we have been the most affected in terms of this virus. Essential workers, because, hey, it's our folks who drive trucks, it's our folks who clean the hospitals, it's our folks who provide all of the amenities for a restaurant and so forth. And at this point, they're the folks that are still out there working when many of us who are professionals can do it from our homes. We can do distant working, which is not available to many of our people with regard to the essential workers. I say that to say that if you look at the neglect that we've had in terms of the healthcare, and then we look at the neglect that we had with regard to what's happening in the cocaine and crack addiction period. And the needles, if you remember, they were using these needles repeatedly, which essentially also cause HIV, AIDS. All of this is very, very transparent in terms of the effects that we occurred in that period of time and the effects that are occurring now. We have the predominant losing of a community, as we have with regard to the war on crime and police activity, where we have more of our communities in prison than any other community in the United States per capita. So I think that looking at those factors, and I'm talking about facts and not even making judgments, why is it that African Americans and Latinos get to be most affected by all of these issues that transpire and impact the community? I can only tell you that it is a factor determining that somehow we as a people are not as important in this society as the privileged in this community. And that's what, when we celebrate the life of John Roberts Lewis, and we celebrate the life of some of our fighters in this area, people don't realize that they haven't walked in our shoes. They haven't had to walk in Harlem and get stopped by cops for no reason. They haven't driven a car in a community and got stopped by a cop for no reason. They don't understand that the fear that we have of police officers because of what has happened in front of our eyes to our folks with no reason. And so there is a lack of understanding, and I'm hoping that based on the recent television view of all of these incidents that have occurred, that people realize why it is that we have a problem with how police handle our community.
Since you kind of went there with it, back in the 60s, did you participate in any protests?
Yes, I did. I I felt that after Martin Luther King, the most important thing was the protest. I protested for youth unemployment, which was mostly African American. I protested against, there was a day of moratorium, I don't know if you remember, which was against the Vietnam War. I protested the Temple University because of the lack of African American Latino students at Temple University, which is in the heart of the African American Latino community, and still there were none in the university. I protested probably the whole year of 1971, and in that year, the protest was so forceful that with a bunch of students, we took over and physically took over. So some people don't understand when we say take over. We physically took over the law school from the dean, and I physically took over the university from then the president-to-be, the vice president, a man by the name of Walkman, and improved the situation for many of our students. But you have to continue to be vigilant, because once you do that, and once you open some doors, there's always somebody coming behind us to begin closing the doors and thinking that there is special treatment. There is no special treatment. I was a top student. I graduated, and I could not get into a law school. I was offered all kinds of jobs in the top accounting firms in this country, and I was second in my class in accounting, and still could not get into law school because there was always something that deterred us. One time it was the SATs, or the next thing it was the LSATs, next thing was the bar exam. There was always an impediment for us to be incorporated into the professional life of this country. And so it is a struggle. And when I say I'm not from here, I'm not from there, it's because if I go back to Puerto Rico, and I got to tell you a long story, I was on the board of an electric company, the top electric company in the country, utility company was Exelon, Fortune 100, and I went to Puerto Rico to try to help them right before the Maria hurricane, and they did not want my help. Why? Because I'm most from over here, and because of corruption, obviously. But I felt that, hey, they consider me, over here an American, and then the Americans consider me, yeah, a foreigner, and put us all in the same class. And so that's why the topic is so unique, especially to the Puerto Ricans, where they feel alien, even though they're citizens by birthright.
Hmm. Okay, so your protests, you said they started after King died. Is that correct?
That's
That's
correct.
when you started. So did you your protests were were they both nonviolent and violent in some cases?
Well, I tried to be as nonviolent as I could, but sometimes you couldn't control some side effects. An example of when I took over the university. At that time, it was the movement of the Black Panthers, and there was an offshoot of the Black Panthers um, in the Puerto Rican community, and that offshoot was very supportive of my activities, and so I couldn't control them if I tried. And so, to some extent, if the president of the university had not been willing to sit down and negotiate opportunities, I don't know what would have happened, and I don't know what would have happened with my career. So I was not always in total control, and always hoped that there would be a rational opportunity to sit down and negotiate and get things done before it was beyond control. When when I passed the bar and became a lawyer, I had an ability to speak with the powers to be and ask them if I could guard and be a witness for those protesters. So what I would do is I would ask for volunteers from the Philadelphia Bar Association, have them wear some kind of identification and surround many of the protesters so that the police and the police horses would not injure many of the protesters. So I did everything I could to support the peaceful and the protests because I was hoping that it wouldn't become violent. But there sometimes it was not totally under control, as it wasn't under Martin Luther King control when the police or some others became violent. There was no one there to really protect them. But I learned from those situations to use whatever I could use to be a protector of many of my protesters in order that they would not be hurt, injured, or arrested. I was involved in one protest in 1969 in which it was in Camden, New Jersey, and a police officer had hit a driver that was stopped for some violation of some lights in the back of his car, and was hit by the cop in his private parts, and it was ruptured and died. And the protest was about 8,000 people at that protest in Camden. It got somewhat violent. The leader of that protest firebombed a bank in Camden, and I was there to get him out of jail, got him into law school, and was able to work out a negotiation for misdemeanor instead of a felony for him so that he could eventually practice law. And today he's a prominent lawyer in New Jersey. I talk about it in my book about this individual and mention his name, even though sometimes he's disappointed me with his politics. He has been very successful and he's able to survive in his profession. But those were the things that were important to me, was to try to protect as much as you could many of the protesters, even though sometimes you knew or felt that it didn't occur right. You had no control over it, and you were in big trouble.
Did Kent State in 70, did that at any point did that make you say maybe I should stop protesting? Did that,
No, that wouldn't have stopped me, since the Kent State activity was related, I guess, to the federal officials that went on that campus. It was close to us in terms of what happened there, and we were totally against the war at the time. I didn't know any better about the war. I almost volunteered in 68, 69 to go to war. Didn't understand how unfavorable it was and how Lyndon Baines Johnson sold down all those down the river because he knew he couldn't win the war. Despite that, he sent us into harm's way there, an irresponsible act on the part of our country. And so when I realized, now in 1970, that this was an uncalled for war, and then one of my heroes, Muhammad Ali, who had been suspended from his world championship and not able to fight, all of that really affected, I think, many of us young people. And so I marched against the war aggressively after that. And the real fact of the matter is that, many of us who died in that war, were also brown and black people, and many of the people who now were affected in these wars, that is a voluntary war, happens to be us again. So, it repeats itself and continues to repeat itself with regard to the poor treatment that we have. And a lot of it is because in terms of job opportunities, what is there? And as a result, if you don't have a good education today, it's a lot harder to find a job. When our parents came around, if you had a hard back and a willingness to work, it was a lot easier. Now you need a substantial education to be able to compete or to enter into almost any entry-level job, since the internet and all of the technology advances have totally changed job opportunities.
The kids that are protesting today, what is your thought on the protests that you see on TV and the way they're going about them and what they're doing?
Initially, when Floyd was killed, I was very, very depressed and not very optimistic. But when I saw the demonstrations build up among all colors of people, black and white, Asians, and people from all backgrounds, and particularly the young people, the young generation, marching, protesting the killing, I became extremely optimistic and hoping that there will be a transformation as there was when we were doing it back in the 60s and 70s. And in the 60s and 70s, yes, we had African Americans, but we had a lot of Jews, we had some young people, students, and there was some cooperation, but not like it is today. And if that determination is evident and continues and impacts our public policy, I think there is hope in making a little more advances than we have. One of the pessimistic things for me was, the Supreme Court has changed. The attitude has changed. Affirmative action has sort of been deterred. If you look at corporate America, you still have 97% of all executives are white males. If you look at all corporate boards, you see that it's still predominantly white. If you look at top executive and C-suites, you see that it's still predominantly white males. And the progress, and I say if Marshall was still around, Justice Marshall, who was sort of an advocate not only with the NAACP but as a justice of the Supreme Court. Some of the things that he professed and wrote about that promoted affirmative action, beneficiaries have been white women. And we would hoped that with the advances and the affirmative action and the opportunities, that it would have advanced all of us. I was a beneficiary of the Martin Luther King's death. I'm hoping that we as a community find other people like me in the African American and in the brown community, Latino community, that will be a beneficiary of George Floyd's death. And so I have to be optimistic because I benefited. Things have gone backwards. And if these young people really consistently live a life like we lived, my whole life had been dedicated to equality of opportunity, to changing the system, to finding a way in which to use our Constitution to benefit us. If all of these people who are there out there understand that that is what will make America great, then I feel that I have to be optimistic. But at the killing, I was really worried. But right now, I have some optimism that if we can continue, just like I did, continued in the fight for equality, that things will hopefully come out to give all of us an opportunity of change. I have hit myself against the wall on many occasions within the last 5 or 6 years, trying to tell these executives, you say you're colorblind. Well, it's not about being colorblind, it's being color conscious. The fact that you have people in your position, you could mentor someone as I was mentored to be where I am and to reach my success. And if you mentor folks within your corporate area, that will know that you're not as racist because you claim not to be, but you're not doing anything to make it happen. And I think that's the education that I hope comes out of all of this effort that I believe is peaceful and accurate and always being sabotaged, as we know, no matter what. But we can't worry about those folks ourselves. We just got to continue to move forward and try to explain to all folks, you haven't walked in my shoes. You don't know what it is to be black and brown and have to be resistant and have to be told that this is not your time. It is our time, and you need to incorporate us in the economic opportunities of this country. I look at the educational system of most of America. It is horrible. It is horrible. I mean, we had an educational system that worked through the period before Martin Luther King and somewhat till after Martin Luther King. Since the 90s until now, we have had horrible educational systems throughout urban America. You go to Chicago, you go to Los Angeles, you go to Philadelphia, you go on to many of these major cities, and education is not educating our folks. And if you're not educating us, what's going to happen? You pay now or pay later.
That's true. That's true. Um, the the defacing of statues that they are doing, is it just, or is it um, messing with government property, in your opinion?
Well, I think there is an alertness today that these figures in history were divisive, and it was not a uniting of the union, but a division of the union and a different philosophy. One was pro-slavery, the other one was anti-slavery. It was an economic issue at the time. And so one of the things that I see as important education that I think most of our young people didn't realize is that whether it was Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, or many of these individuals, they were fighting to continue to enslave a people. So why don't we keep the history of what they were really about, but we don't have to develop monuments for them, since they're not entitled to monuments, since they were wanting to divide the union. So they are not what we stand for, a more perfect union. So I agree that there should be an elimination, but I don't think you want to eliminate history, because history repeats itself. If you don't know the history, you don't know where you're going. So it's important for us to know about these folks, but it's not important to keep them in monuments because they don't deserve them.
Exactly. You ended your last statement about education, and from 90s up to now, the children aren't learning the same things they learned when we were brought up and on before. And the period that you mentioned is the computer age.
That's right.
Do you think that has a lot to do with the fact of them not learning, and how?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people in our generation who didn't grow up with the computer still are not as fluent with it as we should be. I think there's a computer illiteracy among many of the elderly in this country, and we should do something about that. If you try to communicate with your grandmother, your mother, your aunt, many of your family members, everybody uses an iPad or iPhone. No one talks to anyone. They are missing that communication opportunity because we don't educate them. Secondly, if you go to most school systems, and I'm talking about public school systems, and they're in our communities, you don't see everybody with an iPad or an iPhone or some system of communication. Now, if you go to some suburban communities or you go to a private school, you'll see that the utilization of these systems, they communicate with the parents. They tell the parents what the homework is. They make sure that the assignment is done. There's continued communication with the student itself through this network, even when the school is in session outside of the COVID issue. Now with the COVID issue, it's even gotten worse because now it's all learning. And if you don't have the wires into your house, meaning if you don't have the service, and if you don't have a computer or an iPad or an iPhone, there's no way you can receive the information from your teachers. And one, parents don't know how to use it, so how can they help their kids? Two, their kids, unless you have some motivation on their part, they will chuck it off. And three, many of them don't have the systems. So it requires the whole educational process, both for the parents and for the children, in order to have that communication with the teacher in today with the COVID issue for the next 2 years, in order for that kid not to lose 2 years of education.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it's going to be sad too, because people keep thinking that this thing is going to be over soon, and
No.
it's not. It is not going to be over soon. Not by a long shot. Tell me this: the judge is in front of your name. What do you and in reading about you, it just gave me, a history lesson of your life. Do you currently preside over cases?
I was a judge for almost 13 years. I was also the administrative judge, so I had the opportunity also to reform a court system. So unfortunately, all I know how to do is reform. But if you look, being the first is not the easiest thing in the world. And if you look at the history behind it, you see how I was attacked by white judges, how I was attacked by unions, attacked by communities all the time, despite the fact that I was making major contributions in the court system. I left the court system in order to help my good friend Henry Chiseros, who became Secretary of HUD, and wanted me to help him on the reform of public housing. I came back. I could have gone back on the bench, but I didn't do it because there was an opportunity for me to see if I can break some barriers in a lot of different areas. So I became the city lawyer for a while. I became the commissioner of elections for a while. And I am part of what they call the NBA Judicial Council, which is National Bar Association, Judicial Council, the Bar Association. So I'm a part of that and so what I do is I try to protect my colleagues, because now they're about there were only about 4 African-American judges out of 90 when I was on the bench. Now they have over 28, 29 judges. And so there is a different element, and now I can be able to sort of mentor them in those areas as they continue to become in positions of power within the court system. One of the things I think that that we have to learn, and I think a lot of us did not learn, and as I got involved in prison commissions, is this issue of sentencing, and the issue that mandatory sentencing that's been legislated by legislators is something that I've tried to fight as a judge, but I don't know how effective it is when we keep putting more and more people in jail for issues that could have been corrected either through the educational process in the beginning, or could have been corrected by some kind of program of rehabilitation or program of drugs and alcohol and so forth. So there is a lot there that on some commissions that I've served on with regard to that. So I have been able to be heavily involved in using my First Amendment rights, which I wouldn't have been able to use as a judge, which led me in saying what was important to be said about the fact that we have a long way to go.
Okay. My last two
But
questions.
to answer your question, I can go back
Yes.
on the bench as a retired judge tomorrow if I wanted to, yes.
Okay, good. My last two questions. They're kind of related, but they're kind of not. Do you remember where you were when when you found out John F. Kennedy was shot?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell me where you
I
were?
was in high school, and I was the first year of high school, and they closed the school down and told me to go home. and I walked through Harlem because my school was in Harlem. My high school was 124th Street in Lenox, which is in Harlem. So I walked through Harlem, and there was such a shock in a lot of people's lives and understanding. And as you know, the whole weekend was on television right after that, when Ruby was killed and so forth. And so many of the schools closed down with regard to that. And so all of that was so impressionable on a young person like I that didn't understand what was really occurring with regard to the utilization of guns and attacks on a hope that I think a lot of people have seen with regard to JFK.
Okay, and the last one. Where were you, and what was your reaction when you found out that Martin Luther King had been shot and killed?
I was in college, and I tell you, was a different reaction in Harlem. Good question. As I'm coming and leaving college, I would take the subway all the way up to Queens, New York, to go to school there, and back was an hour and a half both ways. And I remember coming back, and you saw all the tear gas, you saw all the breakage, you saw so much activity. It was as if we had gotten into a war. And it was very depressing. And since Martin Luther King was one of my heroes, a hero both as a minister, by the way, and a hero as a civil rights leader. And you got to understand, since I grew up in the Black community, Martin Luther King was more important to me than any other Latino leader, because that was my affinity, my education. I knew very little about Latino history or Puerto Rico history before, so my base was originally, even though my English was terrible. And I tell you, it was a shock to see the destruction of entire Harlem. You had businesses that were totally destroyed, hotels totally destroyed, theaters, and that never came back until Bill Clinton moved into Harlem. When Bill Clinton moved in and opened his office in Harlem, all the Europeans started to move to Harlem. When the Europeans started moving to Harlem, then a lot of other white folks started to move to Harlem. And one of the things that you have in Harlem is a great transportation system, because you've got the subway system in Harlem, can take you downtown in 15, 20 minutes in the subway. And so the values of properties that were totally dead all of a sudden, skyrocketed after Bill Clinton. I was there with Bill Clinton when he was opening the office there, and I could remember many of the people. He would walk around, so he was never afraid of the city. And some guy, you would say, oh, man, how would you spend your time? He would put his arm around the guy. He might have been half drunk, and he's talking to the guy, and it's just like he was back in the old neighborhood, and it was a real ease. And I think the ease that Bill Clinton showed about being in there, and I think the Magic Johnson with his major business investments in Harlem sort of solidified that Harlem, could be an economic engine. And I think those are the two major contributions that have brought Harlem back. So Harlem, it took a long time. You're talking about 68, and then Clinton moved into Harlem after he left office, which would have been 99, 2000 so. You're talking about, wow, that's a long time between 68 and 2000.
Years.
Yeah, how many years?
32 years.
Yeah, before Harlem ever came back.
Oh.
And that's sad, because if you wanted to go shopping, you couldn't find a supermarket. You couldn't buy furniture. The movies were gone outside of the Apollo. The Apollo was the only theater that was still in Harlem. All the other movie theaters were totally gone, so you had to go downtown for the movies. It was a sad episode of 30-some years before Harlem ever came back.
Okay.
Now you can't afford to live in Harlem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Clinton comes and now everything is yeah. Now it's back to the Renaissance days where Harlem Renaissance days where everything is just yeah.
Well, I remember as a kid, I would look out my back window, and there was a major restaurant called the Palm, which was really like a nightclub, and you would see many of the top folks in the African American society coming in. They're coming in furs and well dressed and partying, and that totally died after then. There was a Cotton Club too there, and that all totally died after the '68 riots. It was a sad episode for the economic but today it's a different Harlem that I grew up in.
That's good. That's good. Well, Judge, I thank you so much for this hour.
No, I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to talk to you. And one of the things that we have to do is we got to get the message out that it's important for us to give equal opportunity. Opportunity. I mean, if you read the book by Mrs. Obama, Michelle, you see if she wasn't given equal opportunity, she would have never had the impact that she has today. And she was an affirmative action into Princeton University.
Right.
So,
Yes. So, well, I thank you.
You're welcome.
Please continue to do what you do, because your granddaughter is doing what she does, and you're giving me a lot of information.
Yeah.
I haven't had time to read your book yet because I just got information about interviewing you yesterday. But I'm going to read it.
You're going to enjoy it. You're going to enjoy it, and you're going to see there's some history of our community that even our community doesn't know about, which is the story of my mother, which is the first chapter.
Okay, definitely. Well, thank you, sir. And I hope I can keep in touch with you.
You can, Juan. Anytime you want, Juan.
Yes, sir.
You got my number. You got my number now.
Yes, got it now. So, okay. All right, have a good one.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.